Hello, whispers in the dark viewers. In today's video, I will tell you our story, Reflections of Madness. You may be scared while listening to this story. If you are ready for horror and mystery, let's start. The old, weathered mansion loomed before them, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of neglect. Claire gazed up at the towering structure, a mix of trepidation and curiosity swirling within her. This was her inheritance, a relic of her family's past, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as she and Ethan approached the heavy oak doors. "Are you sure about this, Claire?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "We could always sell the place and find something else, you know." Claire took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the door. "I need to do this, Ethan. This house. It's the only connection I have left to my family. I have to at least try to make it work." Ethan nodded, his hand finding hers and giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm here for you, no matter what." Together, they pushed open the doors and stepped into the dimly lit foyer, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy wash over her as she surveyed the once grand entryway, now in a state of disrepair. "Where do we even start?" Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the silence that permeated the house. Claire's gaze drifted upwards, drawn to the grand staircase that wound its way up to the second floor. "The attic," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that coiled in the pit of her stomach. "I want to start there." Ethan followed her up the creaking stairs, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. The air grew colder and more stale the higher they climbed, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though the house appeared to be completely abandoned. Finally, they reached the attic door, its weathered surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Claire hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the wood, before grasping the handle and pushing it open. A cloud of dust billowed out, causing both Claire and Ethan to cough and wave their hands in front of their faces. As the air cleared, Claire's eyes widened, taking in the vast expanse of the attic, filled with a lifetime's worth of forgotten treasures. "Wow," Ethan breathed, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This place is a gold mine." Claire nodded, her mind already whirring with possibilities. She could see the potential in every tarnished antique, every worn piece of furniture. This was her chance to breathe new life into the old house, to create something beautiful from the ashes of the past. As she wandered deeper into the attic, her eyes were drawn to a large, ornate mirror propped up against the far wall, its surface obscured by a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Intrigued, she approached it, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings that framed the mirror's surface. "Ethan, look at this," she called out, her voice hushed, as if afraid to disturb the mirror's slumber. Ethan joined her, his brow furrowed as he studied the mirror. "That's quite a piece. Where do you think it came from?" Claire shook her head, her gaze transfixed by the mirror's surface. "I'm not sure, but it feels important somehow." Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against the mirror's frame, but Claire felt a sudden, inexplicable pull, as if the mirror itself was calling to her. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she caught a glimpse of her own reflection, distorted and warped by the mirror's surface. For a moment, she thought she saw something else, a flash of movement, a face that was not her own. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her with a sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake. "Claire?" Ethan's voice was soft, laced with concern. "Are you all right?" Claire blinked, tearing her gaze away from the mirror. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just lost in thought, I guess." Ethan studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "Let's see what other treasures we can find up here." Claire nodded, casting one last glance at the mirror before allowing Ethan to lead her deeper into the attic. But even as she explored the dusty, forgotten relics that surrounded her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror's gaze was still upon her, watching, waiting. Something about that mirror unsettled her, stirring up a sense of unease that she couldn't quite place. And as she and Ethan began the process of unearthing the mansion's secrets, she couldn't help but wonder what other horrors might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. As the days passed, Claire found herself inexplicably drawn to the ornate mirror in the attic. She'd caught glimpses of its dark allure from the very first night, but now it had begun to consume her thoughts, like a song playing faintly in the background, demanding her attention. It started innocently enough. Claire would bring her sketchbook up to the attic, using the muted, melancholic light that filtered through the attic's small, grimy window to capture scenes that stirred her emotions. But no matter how she tried, her gaze would always drift back to the mirror. The mirror, once a dusty relic, had become an unconventional muse. She found herself sitting in front of it, paintbrush in hand, attempting to capture something, but she wasn't sure what. She wasn't just painting what she saw. She was painting what she felt, and each brushstroke seemed to pull something hidden and dark from within her. It was on one such night, the attic dimly lit by a single flickering candle, that Claire first noticed the visions. Her hand moved, almost as if guided by some unseen force, painting twisted shapes that she didn't recognize. Shadows appeared on the canvas, not from memory, but from somewhere deep within her, twisted scenes and nightmarish figures that seemed to bleed from her subconscious. And always, when she looked up, the mirror's surface seemed to ripple ever so slightly, as though it were reacting to her work. Ethan had grown increasingly worried about her. He would find her hours later, still sitting in front of the mirror, her eyes hollow, lost in something he couldn't understand. She'd laugh it off when he asked if she was all right, but her smile felt stretched, artificial. One night, unable to ignore his growing concern, Ethan found her hunched over her easel, painting feverishly. Shadows danced across her face as the candlelight flickered, and he noticed her eyes had a strange glint, almost as if she wasn't entirely herself. He placed a hand on her shoulder, hoping to break the spell. "Claire," he whispered, "you've been up here all night again. Please come downstairs. This isn't healthy." She didn't respond at first, her gaze locked on her reflection. Her paint-smeared hand reached up, as if to touch her own face in the mirror, but her fingers stopped just short of the glass. She finally turned, her face drawn, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. "I can't leave it," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's showing me things, Ethan. Things I need to understand." "What are you talking about?" His voice was laced with concern and a touch of fear. "This isn't normal, Claire. That mirror, it's just a mirror. It's not showing you anything." But deep down, he could feel the lie in his own words. He too had seen something in the mirror, flashes of movement that defied logic, strange shapes that seemed to vanish when he looked directly at them. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, his imagination playing tricks. But now, seeing Claire like this, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held something sinister. Claire turned back to her canvas, her face a mask of determination. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I can feel it, Ethan. It's helping me. It's drawing out something real, something important." The next night, Ethan decided he couldn't stand idly by any longer. Determined to break the mirror's grip on her, he crept into the attic with a hammer, ready to shatter its surface and free Claire from its hold. But as he approached it, his heart began to pound. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. The eyes in the mirror held a hint of malice, a twisted, mocking smile curling his own lips. His hand froze, the hammer hanging loosely at his side. He tried to turn away, but his gaze was locked on the reflection, unable to break free. And then he saw it. Claire's reflection appeared behind him, a dark shadow lurking over his shoulder. She was smiling, but it wasn't her usual smile. It was something darker, colder. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart racing. He ran out of the attic, leaving the mirror untouched, his mind reeling. He wanted to tell Claire, but he couldn't bring himself to admit what he had seen. The mirror's influence was spreading, twisting not only Claire but now creeping into his own fears, amplifying them until they felt real. Meanwhile, Claire continued to paint, each piece more haunting than the last. Her work had taken on a macabre beauty, a strange allure that left Ethan unsettled. He could feel the tension growing between them, a shadow lurking at the edge of their conversations. The house, once a silent, decaying relic, now seemed alive, the air thick with an oppressive weight. And always, at the center of it all, was the mirror, waiting, watching, pulling them deeper into its dark embrace. Claire's art had taken on a life of its own. Once stark, muted scenes of sorrow and nostalgia, her work now pulsed with haunting, visceral energy. Each new painting seemed to capture something twisted and strange. Shadowy figures, blurred faces, anguished expressions. Her pieces caught the attention of critics and art enthusiasts alike. Galleries buzzed with praise, calling her work a revelation, a true exploration of the subconscious. Yet with every stroke of her brush, Claire felt herself slipping further from reality. Nights became torture. She would lie awake in bed, the mansion around her groaning and whispering as though it held 1,000 secret voices. Dreams melded with reality, her nights filled with distorted visions of herself and Ethan, twisted and suffering. In these nightmares, she saw herself as something other, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror, eyes hollow and dark, mouth stretched in a silent scream. Sometimes Ethan appeared in these dreams, but it was not the Ethan she knew. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over his bones, his eyes pleading for help she couldn't give. The waking world held no refuge either. Hallucinations crept into her daily life, darkening the edges of her vision. She'd glance over her shoulder, certain she'd seen something slither out of view, only to find herself alone. She tried to confide in Ethan, but her words felt hollow, tainted with the fear that maybe he too was part of this growing nightmare. Ethan's own mind had begun to unravel. He watched helplessly as Claire's once bright spirit dimmed, replaced by a haunted shell of the woman he loved. The more he tried to reach her, the more she seemed to drift away, wrapped in some invisible fog that kept him at arm's length. Frustration and fear churned within him, his helplessness gnawing at him with every haunted glance she gave him. The mirror became a source of bitter arguments. Ethan begged her to cover it, to avoid it altogether, but Claire insisted it was the only thing that kept her connected to her work. It had become her muse, she claimed, and without it, her inspiration would dry up. Ethan could barely hide his rage and fear as he watched her defend the very object that seemed to be devouring her sanity. One night, desperate to free her from the mirror's pull, Ethan moved it out of the attic, dragging it down to the basement while she slept. He hoped that without it, Claire might regain some sense of normalcy, might break free of whatever spell it had cast over her. But the mirror's absence only deepened her despair. She grew frantic, pacing the halls of the mansion, convinced that she heard faint echoes of her own voice calling out from hidden rooms. Her work began to take on an even darker, more terrifying tone, filled with grotesque imagery of her and Ethan, locked in scenes of anguish, betrayal, and fear. The figures on her canvases seemed to writhe in agony, as if they could sense her gaze, as if they were calling out for release. And in her mind, the whispers grew louder. Sometimes, she swore she heard Ethan's voice among them, taunting her, questioning her, feeding on her insecurities. She began to believe the house was alive, watching her every move, whispering doubts and secrets she had long tried to bury. "Claire, you have to stop," Ethan said one night, his voice trembling. "This place, it's not good for you. I'm not good for you, if this is what it's doing to you. Let's leave, Claire. Please, let's go before it's too late." But Claire only laughed, a hollow sound that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "Too late," she echoed. "It was too late the moment we set foot in this house." In a moment of clarity, she reached for him, her fingers trembling. "Ethan, I'm afraid. I can't control it anymore. It's like the mirror is showing me things I can't unsee. I look at my own reflection, and I don't know who I am." Ethan took her hands, gripping them tightly. "We'll leave. We'll burn the mirror. Whatever it takes, Claire, I'll do it. You're not alone in this." But the words felt empty. Even as he spoke, He could feel the mansion's oppressive weight bearing down on them both, a silent, lurking presence that fed on their desperation. He knew, deep down, that escaping would not be so easy, that whatever darkness lived within these walls had already begun to take root within them. The nightmares grew worse. Claire could no longer distinguish dream from reality, her visions growing more vivid and violent. She saw herself lashing out at Ethan, his face twisted in terror as she advanced on him, her own reflection laughing back at her from the shadows. She woke screaming, clawing at the air, only to find Ethan's pale, haunted eyes watching her, fear etched across his face. He couldn't help but feel the same dark presence curling around his own mind. He heard whispers too, now voices that echoed his worst fears, that he was powerless, that he couldn't protect Claire, that the house itself wanted them both. Shadows moved in his periphery, flickering just out of reach, whispering secrets he dared not repeat. The mansion had become a prison, each room steeped in dread, every corner hiding unseen eyes. The air thickened with a stifling, oppressive heat, the shadows seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The voices grew louder, taunting, mocking, feeding off their insecurities and regrets. One night, as Claire stood in the dim glow of the attic, paintbrush in hand, she glanced into the mirror and saw herself there, twisted and smiling, her eyes hollow and empty. In that moment, she realized with cold certainty that the house had already claimed her. And as she stared into her reflection's lifeless gaze, she wondered if she'd ever truly left the mirror's embrace, or if she'd ever leave again. Claire's obsession with the mirror had reached its breaking point. Every night, as shadows deepened and the mansion's air thickened, she felt it calling to her. But tonight was different. Something dark and festering had settled into her chest, and the need for answers consumed her. Driven by an insatiable curiosity mingled with fear, Claire began to scour the mansion for clues. She tore through stacks of old letters, yellowed photographs, and dusty journals, each discovery weaving together the mirror's horrifying legacy. Through these fragments of the past, she learned that she was not the first to fall under the mirror's spell. The previous owners, each drawn to the mirror's hypnotic gaze, had been driven to madness. Trapped in endless cycles of obsession, they'd been haunted by visions, their minds warped until they lost all sense of themselves. One journal, written in a shaky hand, detailed a final warning. The mirror does not reveal truths, it creates them. Whatever you see within it will consume you if you let it. Destroy it or let it destroy you. The words clawed at her, ripping through any remaining illusions she had held about the mirror. It wasn't an object of inspiration. It was a predator, feeding on her darkest fears, twisting her soul with each glance. The mirror's reflections were lies given form, terrors that grew stronger each time she surrendered to its pull. And worse, she had dragged Ethan down with her. Steeling herself, Claire found Ethan, who had withdrawn to the far end of the mansion, as though trying to hide from the shadows that plagued him. His face was haggard, his once steady hands trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I found the truth about the mirror. It's been feeding off us. It's driven others to madness, like it's doing to us." Ethan's gaze lifted to hers, a glimmer of clarity returning. He looked as though he wanted to deny her words, but something deep within him knew it was true. He had felt its pull, seen the whispers that lingered in every corner of the house, pressing him down with memories he could no longer ignore. "We have to end this," she said, her voice wavering but determined. Together, they returned to the attic, their steps echoing in the silence as they faced the mirror. Its dark, polished surface seemed to ripple, as if sensing their resolve. For the first time, Ethan saw it for what it truly was. Not a reflection, but a door to something darker, something that hungered for them. The moment they stepped into its shadow, the air thickened, and the mirror's surface began to distort, twisting into shapes that defied logic, images that clawed at their deepest fears. Claire's reflection stared back at her, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollowed by guilt and regret. Behind her own reflection stood Ethan, his face etched with betrayal, twisted in accusations she had long feared. "You'll leave him," her reflection hissed, the voice sounding like her own, but colder. "You're a weight around his neck," dragging him into the dark. Ethan's own reflection glared back, his features distorted by anger and anguish. "You can't save her," it whispered, the words like knives in his chest. "She's already lost, and soon you'll be too." The images shifted, growing more vivid, more real, each scene dredging up their insecurities, every whispered fear feeding the mirror's insatiable appetite. "No," Claire whispered, her voice shaking but defiant. "You're not real. You're nothing but shadows." With a surge of fury, she reached out, her hand grasping a nearby candlestick. She raised it high, her mind flooded with a single, terrifying certainty. They could not escape the mirror. It had already claimed too much of them, too much of their lives. But they could destroy it. "Claire, wait!" Ethan's voice was hoarse, but something in her eyes made him step back, his fear giving way to understanding. This was the only way. With all the strength she could muster, Claire brought the candlestick down against the mirror's surface. The glass shattered, splintering into thousands of tiny shards that scattered across the attic floor. A cold, piercing wind filled the room, howling as if the mirror itself were screaming, each shard reflecting twisted fragments of their fears as they broke away, each echoing one final curse. And then silence. The shattered pieces lay at their feet, glinting in the dim light. The oppressive weight in the room had lifted, but the air was filled with a new heaviness, the remnants of their own fears, now free of the mirror's spell, no longer cloaked by the house's shadow. They had destroyed the mirror, but in doing so, they had cracked open the darkest parts of themselves, forced to confront their buried insecurities, their hidden pain. Claire sank to her knees, her breath ragged, staring down at the shattered pieces. She saw her reflection fragmented in the broken glass, each piece showing a different part of her face, each one scarred by the journey she had just endured. She knew she would never look at herself the same way again. Ethan knelt beside her, taking her hand, his touch grounding her, reminding her that they were still here, still together. But they were no longer the same. The mirror had torn open wounds they'd long hidden, scars that would remain even as they moved forward. They had broken free, but at a cost. Together, they rose, leaving the shards of glass behind, stepping out of the attic for the final time. The house was silent, the shadows that once lingered now mere remnants of a nightmare. But they both knew the journey wasn't over. The mirror's influence might be gone, but the darkness it had unearthed would stay with them, a silent reminder of the horrors they had faced. As they walked away, hand in hand, each step felt like shedding an old skin, a slow and painful transformation into something new. They would rebuild piece by piece, learning to trust themselves and each other again. And though they could never forget the mirror or the shadows it had cast, they could begin, finally, to face the future. For the first time in weeks, they stepped outside, breathing in the crisp, clean air. And as they looked back at the mansion one last time, they knew it would always be a part of them. A dark memory, a scar that marked their survival. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked our video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like our video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.